Hi, I'm Mark Summers with Jamestown Rediscovery, and in this episode, entitled He That Will Not Work, Shall Not Eat, we're going to discuss the larger-than-life character of Captain John Smith, a man I argue would have been better off in Massachusetts than in Virginia. Much of what we know about Jamestown comes through the writings of Captain John Smith, but his writing style was quite extraordinary, and he was the hero of all the books he wrote about himself. But he became a popular hero in the American South and in Virginia in particular during the 19th century. And Virginians like to point out that Jamestown, Virginia was the first permanent English settlement in North America, not Massachusetts. Aside from John Smith's writings, there's not much left from Jamestown, except for a church tower constructed in 1690, which still stands at the park today. It was depicted in lithographs, drawings, and paintings, many of which hung in southern parlors, as the last symbol of the Jamestown story. This image even ended up on the Texas Republic $5 bill, since so many Anglo-Texans had Virginia ancestry. In a way, the Jamestown Church Tower was the South's version of the Rock at Plymouth. So a curious figure stood in front of the church tower in 1859. Senator Edward Everett of Massachusetts, a popular speaker, famous for speaking for 2 hours before the Gettysburg Address in 1863, delivered a speech before the Civil War praising the virtues of Virginia and Jamestown in particular. This was not typical for Massachusetts men at the time, but his speech was so remarkable, even John Tyler said it was a great speech, but should have been delivered by a Virginian. But just 2 months later, John Brown's raid happened at Harper's Ferry. Virginia will be pulled out of the Union, and the unifying story of Jamestown became a Southern story instead of a national story. Many Massachusetts writers began to question Virginia history. In 1842, the poet John Greenleaf Whittier wrote From Massachusetts to Virginia, a poem in response to the return of a fugitive slave from Boston to Norfolk. In the poem, he evoked Virginia and Massachusetts' fight for liberty during the American Revolution, but said while Massachusetts remained free, Virginia forgot the true meaning of liberty. Virginia, to Whittier, represented a corrupt state. Other New England writers started to attack the famous Jamestown stories and legends, including John Smith's account of being rescued by Pocahontas. While there was probably a real event that happened, along Powhatan terms that was more nuanced, John Smith's telling of the story of a princess falling in love with him seemed a little too good to be true. And Henry Adams lampooned the story as a symbol that all was wrong with Virginia heritage. It didn't really have much substance behind the surface. Another writer who said similar views was the Massachusetts historian at Harvard, Charles Dean. Many New England writers may have acknowledged that Jamestown was older, but the Mayflower Pilgrims were more authentically American because they stood for liberty. The Mayflower story also gained a lot of traction in 1851 with the rediscovery of the lost papers of William Bradford. They were in a London library and had been seized during the American Revolution, but they were republished as of Plymouth Plantation, and many Americans began to read about the heroic tales of pilgrims. So if the Pilgrims stood for freedom and religious liberty, what did Jamestown stand for? When shots rang out at Fort Sumter and Virginia leaves the Union in April of 1861, Richmond became the capital of the Confederacy, and Virginia became the place where many Union soldiers were killed and buried. And in 1863, it was a Virginian, Robert E. Lee, who invaded the North and was stopped at a battle called Gettysburg in 1863. At the dedication of the cemetery at Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln delivered the famous Gettysburg Address. So 1863 was a key year for saving the Union, but it was also the year that Abraham Lincoln signed the Thanksgiving holiday into law. And with the Thanksgiving holiday, meaning the Pilgrim version, not the Virginia version in 1619, we see that the United States will become the land of the Pilgrim's pride, not of John Smith. So the irony is, John Smith became a symbol of Southern aristocracy and Cavalier Confederate culture, when he was very much the opposite of that. Smith was born in rural Lincolnshire in a town called Willoughby. He grew up in an area that was known for adhering to the Puritan movement. A few miles north of Willoughby in Alford, John Smith attended grammar school, where he was taught by the Reverend Francis Marbury, a radical Puritan minister that actually spent several years in prison when he said that English bishops were corrupt and not fully educated. He was a particular thorn in the side of the Archbishop of London, and he was sent after his release from prison to Alford because he could do very little harm in such a small community. But Francis Marbury was also the father of Anne Marbury Hutchinson, who becomes quite notorious in Massachusetts when she is banished from that colony for preaching. It's interesting to note that John Smith may have had a Puritan upbringing because it might explain a lot of his extraordinary tales or feats of courage and daring. When he took over the Jamestown fort in 1608, he decreed that people of all social classes would have to do manual labor by saying, "He that would not work shall not eat." But the origin of that quote is from 2 Thessalonians 3:10, and Puritans tended to quote scripture without being priests. Now, was the site of this location the Jamestown storehouse? Archaeologists found the soil stains, the features marking the location of that building, in 2009. But if John Smith says these words in the middle of the Jamestown fort, it's interesting to note that many of the Jamestown settlers and other leaders may have found John Smith's words very offensive because of where they came from. It's interesting to note that many of John Smith's enemies were either High Church Anglican or from Catholic families, like Edward Murray Wingfield, who Smith helped overthrow in 1607, or Captain Gabriel Archer, whose grave was identified in 2014. His grave also indicated that there was a Roman Catholic reliquary with 7 human bones inside, the bones of a saint. Archer's family was known to be recusant, meaning they were taxed and persecuted for their beliefs. Also, George Percy came from a noble Catholic family, as he was the son of the Earl of Northumberland, and his own cousin was implicated in the famous gunpowder plot in 1605, where Guy Fawkes and some of his associates, like Thomas Percy, were plotting to kill the king and Parliament in a major assassination attempt. Many English Catholics were persecuted as a result. Smith himself may have had a gunpowder plot against him. A few months after John Smith's extraordinary statement of "He that will not work shall not eat," he was asleep on a canoe, and a spark landed on his gunpowder bag, wounding him so badly he returns to England. George Percy, a known Smith enemy, takes command, and it was Percy who was in charge when the starving time began 1 month later, which led to the deaths of 90% of the colonists. It was incompetent leadership, and John Smith never let Percy forget who was in charge during the starving time. 4 years later, John Smith will return to America and what was then called Northern Virginia, off the coast of Maine. And on this voyage, his associate Thomas Hunt will kidnap and sell Squanto into slavery, who will return to Massachusetts and end up becoming a translator for the Pilgrims. But Smith's account of his whaling voyage will actually lead to his publication, where you see the phrase New England being used for the first time. It's a bit of a marketing trick, because to call something New England made it sound much more nice and pleasant than it actually may have been in reality. And we see on his map the first image of John Smith taken from life. This image of John Smith mentions he's the Admiral of New England, not a former leader of Virginia. And it's the image that we now use for his statue at historic Jamestown. So if John Smith spent the rest of his life promoting New England over Virginia, why did the Pilgrims hire Miles Standish to be their military commander? Smith certainly was writing to the Pilgrims in Holland, and they liked his maps and charts, but they would not hire the vainglorious Smith, who had a very bad reputation. Smith was very bitter about this. New England was his idea, but he never got the credit for it. And in fact, John Smith, to his dying day, becomes remembered more for Jamestown, Virginia, a place he actually didn't admire very much. John Smith, the Southern symbol, is the reason why New England is New England today. Thanks for watching, and please support us. Stay safe out there.